Be sure to check out Rob Plays. There you can hang out with me while we play video games and talk about life stuff. So as we continue our discussion on Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, what I'm thinking is that you guys are gonna freak as we get to this video, because if you guys are anything like me, I was reading through this comic and I was like, oh my God. And this is why I love Jonathan Hickman writing so much, because God, he knows how to tell one hell of a story. So in the last video, we had talked about how the Old Man Logan story dealt with the death of all the superheroes and the supervillains taking over the world. And at the end of that story, Wolverine had basically taken the son of the Incredible Hulk as a newborn and went forward with the intention of creating a resistance to get rid of all the supervillains. And so what had happened is, in that reality, the supervillains were completely eliminated and society began to go back to a state of normalcy. But the problem here is that over time, the Earth began dying. And so the result was that those individuals in the future, though both superheroes and normal humans, had worked together to create a portal, to create a machine that would allow them to travel into the past in order to ensure their survival. But in order to power that machine, they had to take Galactus from the future, kill him, and then use his power cosmic to power the machine. And so the result was that once they achieved that goal, the future body of Galactus had fallen through the rift and landed in the present, which was discovered by Mole Man, who informed Reed Richards of what was going on. And so what we do is we pick up with this, and that Silver Surfer had discovered that Reed Richards buried the body of future Galactus, and Silver Surfer reported back to Galactus what it was that he had found, simply because this was such an important situation. And so what happens here is that Galactus from the present simply shows up on the planet Earth. And this is so cool because he doesn't go through a whole bunch of introductions, he doesn't do any threatening, he simply just shows up to Reed Richards when Reed Richards appears to meet Galactus, and Galactus just says, explain. And this, I think, is one of the perfect examples. It's so cool how Hickman takes concepts, takes like all these thoughts and emotions and feelings and throws them into a simple word. Because when Galactus just shows up and says explain, it denotes authority, it denotes if you don't give me what I want to know, I'm going to destroy your world. I mean, it's such a cool series of things that go into this. But what Reed does is he effectively tells Galactus exactly what I just said a second ago about the future of the Old Man Logan universe and the travel through time. And the result is that Reed says that for him, it just seemed right to bury that version of Galactus. It didn't seem right to simply just leave his decaying corpse on the surface of the world. Now, while Reed doesn't necessarily say it either, I would imagine that to a degree, there would be panic. If, for example, the Avengers were just traveling around the world, or if the X-Men were just traveling around the world doing whatever the Avengers and the X-Men do in their off time, and they stumbled across the decaying corpse of Galactus on the surface of the planet, they would probably start freaking out, and they would be like, oh my God, Galactus is dead, and who knows who did it, and it would turn into a great big huge thing. And so it was probably kind of trying to eliminate panic, more or less. But the fact remains here that once Galactus is informed of everything that's going on by Reed, he tells the Silver Surfer to locate the new world that Reed had put the survivors on and sent them off to. And so once Silver Surfer locates New World, he tells Galactus exactly where it is, and Galactus says that they're immediately going to leave and they're going to go find New World and investigate for themselves. Now, this is all extremely important, and the reason why is because this deals directly with Franklin Richards, and this tells us why Galactus is afraid of Franklin Richards. What we find out is that with Johnny Storm showing up and trying to figure things out, trying to understand whether or not he needs to react in a defensive or an offensive capacity, when Reed tells Johnny that he's going to leave with Galactus, there's really no discussion here. There's no debate, there's no, well, let's talk things out and figure things out. Galactus wants to find out what's going on, Reed's gonna go with him, and there's no two ways about it. And so what happens is that once the two take off, once the Silver Surfer goes with Galactus and Reed Richards to find out what's going on in New World, we pick up with New World. But something interesting to note here, and this is why I say this is all about Franklin Richards, is because when they arrive, Galactus makes mention to Reed about how fast he had left Earth. And Reed says yes, he noticed that, but he figured that if Galactus was leaving the Earth faster than normal, there was probably a reason why, and Reed was simply going to wait and see whether or not that reason revealed itself. But instead, Galactus tells him directly. What he says is that he left the planet Earth in order to avoid a conflict that could have been catastrophic on a universal scale, meaning it could have laid waste to the universe. And when Reed asks what it is that Galactus is talking about, Galactus says that the barriers in Franklin Richards' mind have been removed, which of course was done by his future self, and that Reed and Galactus need to talk about Franklin. Now, again, this is a really big deal because Galactus says that he was afraid, basically. He left the planet Earth because he was afraid, and by combining those two things together, he left the planet Earth because he was afraid of facing Franklin Richards. Now, this doesn't mean that Galactus in and of himself is terrified of the ability that someone could have to warp reality, and in fact, this really isn't the case with Franklin. Franklin can warp reality, but it's the fact that Galactus is afraid of Franklin because of the things he's done in the past. Way back in the 1990s, during the Abraxas saga, when Galactus was killed, Abraxas took his place, but then Franklin Richards basically resurrected Galactus from the dead. The fact that he brought back a cosmic entity from the dead tells us how powerful Franklin is. At the same time, Franklin's a child, meaning that his imagination can run wild. He can create and manifest all kinds of different things that would wreak havoc on the world as a whole, and it could be that Franklin doesn't know how to undo those things. So he could manifest some force that would wipe out the universe entirely and then not be able to undo that. We've never really seen an instance where that's happened before, but it doesn't mean that it couldn't. Now, while we don't find out exactly what it was that Galactus and Reed Richards talked about, instead, Hickman actually just skips over that. Now, we'll find out exactly what it is that he's talking about once we see the Mad Celestial show up and Franklin Richards battle them. That entire scenario effectively speaks for itself, but more so than that, we'll actually see Galactus speaking directly to Franklin Richards about the power he possesses and what it is that he's capable of doing and how he relates to Galactus himself. But from here, we basically just show up at New Earth and we see that Galactus and Reed Richards are talking about everything that's going on. And so where Galactus initially asks how it was that New Earth was created, how it was all this came into existence, again, Reed Richards basically rehashes what we know about the future of the Old Man Logan universe. And when Galactus asks whether or not Reed Richards can prevent this from happening, that is to say, he can effectively save that future from coming to an end, Reed begins to reflect on his time with the Council of Reeds, and he makes the case that yes, most likely he can solve this problem that would have resulted in the destruction of the future. The result is that because Reed would effectively be stopping those individuals from the future and having to come to the past in the first place and initiate this entire series of events, for Galactus, this world will simply cease to exist. And so instead of allowing it to pass, instead of allowing it to basically vanish without any real advantage, Galactus decides to consume it. Now, one of my favorite things here is that the occupants of New World initially protest. They say, no, Galactus cannot destroy their world, and Galactus's reply is, who tests God and does not wager their life, a price will be paid. And this is why I love Galactus so much, because this is just a cool thing to say. It's just a cool line to say. I like the way it sounds, to be honest with you guys. And I might even make like a wallpaper or something out of it, but I think it's a really cool moment. It's just nothing really significant here. It's just, these are one of the things that I like about Hickman's writing. And so basically the people on this planet, on New World, are given a chance to leave. What Galactus says is that he is going to consume the world. He's going to end all of it. But instead of simply just killing all those individuals on New World, what he's going to do is allow Reed Richards to get as many people off the planet as possible between the time that Galactus begins consuming his machine in order to consume the world and the time that he's done doing that. And so from here, what we do is we transition back to the future of Franklin Richards, and we pick up with his character after he had woken up the powers of his younger self. Now, I know that this is a lot of time traveling. I know this is a lot of bouncing around, but these things are extremely important for understanding the very end of this story and why things unfold the way they do. What happens here is we pick up with the adult Franklin Richards when he simply arrives in the future, and there's nothing here. It's just a giant expanse of white. We don't really know what's going on here. There's no planet, there's no greenery, no buildings, no nothing. It's just total emptiness. And the question is asked by an individual that we can't see whether or not Franklin was successful. And what he says is yes. He had basically woken up the powers of his younger self, removed those mental blocks, and so now the younger Franklin Richards has the power to warp reality. In addition to this, the adult Franklin Richards had told Valeria that all hope lies in Doom. Now we'll find out why Dr. Doom is such an important part of Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, but what we learn is that the adult version of Valeria is also here alongside the adult version of Franklin Richards. And so what we're told is that the entire basis behind this, the entire premise behind the adult Franklin Richards going into the past was performed by the father of Reed Richards, Nathaniel. Now again, when we started Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, we had talked about how the father of Reed Richards, Nathaniel Richards, was basically absentee throughout almost his entire life. He didn't really spend much time talking to his son because he wasn't there. While he was part of Reed's life when he was very, very young, Nathaniel had simply just vanished for reasons that weren't really explained. what Hickman's run of the Fantastic Four does is it basically fills in the gaps, and it simply says that at this point, all they can do is just see how things unfold. Now again, this is really just very confusing here because the indication seems to be that this future is coming to an end and that some window, some opportunity is effectively closing with each moment that passes, and this seems to be their last-ditch effort to ensure that this future does not come to fruition. Now again, we don't really know what this future is, we just know that something's going on and they're trying to keep it from happening. And so while Valeria travels back and she effectively leaves, what Franklin Richards does as an adult is he manipulates this pocket reality, this little dimension that he's created due to the fact that apparently because the future is coming to an end, this is a safe space, that time will change, time will pass, but instead things will stay exactly the way they are, the way he's making them within this small space. Now this is all metatextual stuff, this is all metatextual commentary, and it can be a little bit daunting, but things will make sense. And the reason why is because Nathaniel Richards actually jumps into the past to visit Reed Richards when he was in college alongside Ben Grimm. And while they were together, while they were spending time with one another, what Nathaniel does is he basically explains why he was gone for so long. What he says is that at some point along the line, he and a multitude of other Nathaniel Richards were pulled into a singularity to battle some individual with immense power. And because of this, Nathaniel himself had gained the ability to control time, to manipulate time. The downside to this was that in the far distant future, time itself was controlled by a man named Immortus, and it was monitored by the Time Variance Authority, meaning that individuals who meddle with time are strictly punished. And so the result is that because both Nathaniel Richards from the main Marvel universe and all the other alternate reality versions of Nathaniel had all developed the ability to manipulate time after battling this foe, they were all brought forward to Immortus, and they were basically instructed that not all of them can have this power, only one of them can. But because the power is part of them on a genetic level, it can't be removed, meaning the only way to ensure that only one of them can have the power is to eliminate every version of Nathaniel Richards except for one. And so what this did is it initiated something called the Great Hunt, and it was basically all these different versions of Nathaniel Richards from across the cosmos hunting each other down and trying to kill each other. And so for those of you guys who read Spider-Verse and you followed the events with the Inheritors chasing down all the different versions of Spider-Man and Spider-Woman from across the multiverse, this is the equivalent of that, except it would be as if all the Spider-Men were hunting each other down. And so what ends up happening is Nathaniel petitions Reed Richards to basically help him take care of the last version of Nathaniel so that the main Marvel Universe Nathaniel Richards will be the last one left. Now while Reed himself is extremely intelligent during his college years, he's nowhere near as intelligent as Dr. Doom. Now this will change over time due to the fact that Dr. Doom's arrogance will actually get the better of him. But at the moment, Reed is still smart, but Doom knows a little bit more about both technology and the ability to manipulate time. And so what ends up happening is Nathaniel Richards and Ben Grimm and Reed Richards and Dr. Doom from the past, from their college years, basically travel back into the future, and they encounter this second to last remaining version of Nathaniel, this evil version of himself. Now, where this isn't super important, where this isn't necessarily the most important thing coming out of the story, it actually is the basis for why Franklin Richards is doing the things that he's doing. And what we find out here is that with these versions of Nathaniel battling one another, ultimately it all comes down to this very notion that Nathaniel is going to be the last one left. He essentially kills all the other versions of himself. And so with these two versions of Nathaniel Richards battling one another, the conflict essentially goes exactly the way that we would suspect, in the sense that there's some give and take. There's the possibility that the main version of Nathaniel Richards will lose, but ultimately he ends up coming out on top with the help of Reed Richards, Ben Grimm, and Dr. Doom from the past. And so while they're successful in killing this other version of himself, Nathaniel Richards is basically the last one left now. The main version of Nathaniel Richards is the only iteration of himself. Now, having said that, what we do now is we pick up with Nathaniel traveling back to the future to meet Franklin Richards. And this is extremely important. And if there's nothing else that you remember from the story, please remember this. What ends up happening here is that Franklin begins to talk with Nathaniel, and he asks him, were you successful in killing that other version of yourself? And Nathaniel says yes. And so the result is that Franklin says perfect and destroys the reality around Nathaniel. And what this does is it tells us that Nathaniel himself is almost powerless powerless to stop everything that's going on, that he doesn't even really understand why it is that Franklin's doing this. And what Franklin says is that, one, he disabled the ability of Nathaniel to use his own powers by controlling both reality around him and manipulating his brain, but also that when Nathaniel engaged in the Great Hunt and began killing off all the other versions of himself, that he made all those alternate reality versions of Reed Richards fatherless. And the reason why this is a big deal is because in our earlier versions of Hickman's run of Fantastic Four, we had talked about how those alternate reality versions of Reed Richards had created the Council of Reeds and abandoned their families because they didn't have the guidance of their fathers. And the reason they didn't have the guidance of their fathers is because this great hunt took place and their fathers were killed off. And so what Franklin is doing here is he's not really gaining revenge on Nathaniel. He's basically saying that Nathaniel in and of himself is the reason why all this happened in the first place. And so what we do, and something you may have noticed as we were going through this comic, is we actually saw some discussion between Valeria and Susan, and we pick up with that. While there is a lot of fluff that goes on in the two of them talking, which is really just a mother relating to her daughter, or at least Valeria relating to her mother in her younger form, not everything that happens here is extremely important. And in fact, the only thing that's really important is what she says to Susan Storm at the end. What Valeria tells her is that when everything seems like it's darkest, when everything seems like it's going to end and all hope seems to be gone, that Susan Storm is going to have to hold on. She's going to have to keep fighting despite the fact that the circumstances seem bleak. But at the moment that she does that, at the time when everything seems like it's going to crack and it's going to fall to pieces, that something will come to save her. Now, we find out what that something is again at the end of this story. I know it seems really, really wild, but this, yeah, it's it's awesome what happens. I'm almost inclined to spoil it because I've done it before, but I don't really want to. Those of you guys who have read Hickman's Fantastic Four, please don't spoil this. Please don't tell people what happens. But in the end, what ends up happening is that Valeria effectively departs. As things begin to come to a close, she takes off and she goes back with Franklin Richards. And what we find out is that something had happened in the past that began this wave of destruction throughout the multiverse, and the multiverse itself was effectively collapsing. And this pocket universe that Franklin had made was designed to keep space-time separate from around them. But the issue with this is that Franklin himself can warp reality, but in order for him to be able to warp it, he has to be in control of it. And the issue is that if reality is operating outside of his control, he can't do anything to stop it. His powers effectively work against him. And that seems to be what's happening here. And so as the two of them begin to get sucked into this rift, what ends up happening is they jump through, and then we actually won't see or hear from them until the very end of this story. But with that being said, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. Let me know what you guys think about Hickman's Fantastic Four. Again, as with the last video, I know this can be a little bit daunting and things will actually be a lot easier to understand going forward. But again, I promise all of this will make sense once we get to the end, and that's the nature of a Hickman story. Hickman stories draw threads from all over the place. They pull threads from everywhere, and nothing seems to make sense. But then at the very, very end, he writes a single comic that wraps all that stuff up, and then you just get the light bulb effect. Oh, I understand what he was doing. That's exactly what ends up happening. So don't worry, guys. Everything will make sense at the end of this, which will probably happen in the next 3 or 4 videos or so. We've got a few more things to cover, especially with the death of Johnny Storm and the future of Ben Grimm. But aside from that, we can actually sort of jump towards the end and then just fill things in according to whatever seems to be interesting. But yeah, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this video up, and I will catch you guys later. Peace.